message.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest outcomes of this election really is, what does it mean for Africa, knowing pretty well that Africa has a key link with the United States. And if you can join me now on our Super Bowl, we'll be able to walk you through what this technically means for Africa, knowing pretty well we have the Africa Growth Opportunity Act, which was established in 2000 by former US President, that is Bill Clinton.
Right.
And the law has been quite instrumental in terms of boosting trade numbers between Africa and the United States. And one of the purposes was basically to actually assist economies of sub-Saharan Africa and improve economic relations. But more interestingly, let's look at what has been the volumes like after AGOA. If you can move to the next slide, where you'll also get a snapshot of what an AGOA was and how many years was it meant to span. Initially, it was envisaged that it would actually take 15 years, and we did see a review of this by President Barack Obama, actually signing it for an extension of about 10 years, and it's going to run till 2025.
That was during the Global Entrepreneurship Summit?
Oh, yes.
Right.
He actually made this in the Oval Office after coming to Africa to attend the Global Entrepreneurship Summit that was actually held in Nairobi. And one of the striking aspects about AGOA, just to put it into perspective, it has a number of products that can be exported from Africa. They actually come to about 6,000 products, ranging from textile to farm implements, machinery. It's quite a long list. But let me narrow down to a number of, let me narrow down to what it means for the textile and apparel industry. If you can move to the next slide, we'll be able to see this. And Kenya has been a significant beneficiary under AGOA, of course, knowing pretty well that Kenya does have the special economic zones that are based here in the country. And there's talk of setting up more, even as we continue to do the standard gauge railway line. And some of these zones will be set up in Naivasha, where which will actually be one of the key port of call for this particular rail line. And of course, looking at AGOA, let's look at the potential impact this will have moving forward.
Right.
And it is estimated that if AGOA is fully utilized, we're talking about 100,000 jobs to the economy of Kenya. And of course, spreading across East Africa, being Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan. And this translates to about $1 billion US. And if you're to just approximate, it's translating to around 100 billion shillings worth of revenue to the government in terms of taxes. And of course, Africa at large, we're looking at less than 2% in textile has actually been fully implemented when it comes to the AGOA. And interestingly, two countries stand out, as you'll see in the next slide, and that is Ethiopia and Kenya, which also hold enormous potential of becoming the textile hub for the region. And a report by McKinsey & Company predicts that the next hub for apparel sourcing will be Ethiopia and Kenya. You do know Ethiopia does have a textile, thriving textile industry really, and of course Kenya did recently announce that they are setting up a leather factory. So Joy, that's just a quick snapshot of what AGOA means for Kenya. And let's see whether Donald Trump will be able to push forward to ensure more concessions for the African continent.
Well, it's still unpredictable what exactly his plan is for the African continent, because throughout his campaign, we have seen that he has, not really been as vocal as we would have expected him to be when it comes to talking about what his plan is for Africa.
Oh, yes.
Foreign policy. He's only been big on countries like China, countries like Syria, and he's also talked about, the South China Sea as well, where he actually sees a lot of potential for trade. And despite the fact that during his campaigns, we had a number of Indians coming through and saying they were supporting Donald Trump, he hasn't really talked about what his plan is for a country like India that is growing at a pretty fast pace when it comes to trade or international trade as well.
Interesting. Because, I mean, the immigration debate is quite the area that a lot of analysts are looking at. How will Trump sort of align it to this particular issue around the trade linkages around how can immigrants still work in the United States and as well as create more jobs for the economy. And all this will require a lot of stimulus to the economy by having what he talked about in his acceptance speech, issues to do with infrastructure, which will be critical in terms of moving the American economy to what he terms making America great.
Again. All right, let's now focus on how this can actually associate with us on the African continent. And we're now joined by Felix Okach, who is an international trade expert. Thank you so much for joining us, Felix. Well, first, what do you make of the Donald Trump win, and how do you think we as Africans can actually use this to the best of our advantage?
Thank you very much for asking me that question. For Africa, of course, it's sad. Most people preferred Hillary Clinton to win, but she's lost. But competition is always like that. What I know is that U.S., now the Republicans, they don't have a policy of getting concerned about outside. They're mainly concerned about their country, normally the Southerners, Texas, Louisiana, that area. So I don't see them focusing much on Africa, the way Obama tried when he was the president. But all in all, we'll still have to trade with the U.S., because you've mentioned AGOA. You see, AGOA has got a range of 6,000 goods, classification of goods, but you're only dwelling on one, which is apparel. But all in all, we need to change our attitude and work for ourselves. But I don't see them getting concerned about, Donald Trump getting concerned about Africa much.
All right. And when you say you don't see him really concentrating much on Africa, if I might take you back to George Bush's presidency, we did see him dedicate quite an amount of money when it comes to, say, the Global Fund that was dedicated to the health sector on the African continent. Do you think that maybe in one way or another, that legacy is going to continue into Donald Trump's presidency?
It might, but not to an extent that they'll follow it through. You remember the time of George Bush, one time he was asked where Nigeria is or Africa is, then he mentioned that Africa is in Nigeria. The same thing Donald Trump, they don't know much about us. You see when even Donald Trump, when he was campaigning, he was saying that he does black Africans, they are coming, taking jobs from them, they come to their country, the people stealing from their government and still staying in this country. Many of those kind of remarks are there. So for them, Africa, they'll just give a token for purposes of diplomatic relations. But
should we prepare for a time where we are going to see less aid coming in from the United States? And if yes, where else do we get the aid that was coming from the United States now that we are not expecting much from the Donald Trump presidency?
Much of trade direction now, I see it going towards China and a bit of Europe. So the Americans, they're not concerned about Africa much. They're concerned with the Trans-Pacific region, Mexico area, and northern Canada and NAFTA. But in our case, the trend of things are moving towards China. You see the standard gauge railway. You've seen certain loan concessions from that far east, and that's the direction of trade. And U.S., after this election, to them, Africa is not in the equation.
Views there which sort of disagree with you on that. We did hear Donald Trump in his acceptance speech saying that he'll be able to reach out and try to work with those who elected him and those who didn't. Perhaps from an alternative view, school of thought really, if you look at the critical dynamics, America really needs Africa at this moment, now that you're seeing China growth has been slowing down. And of course, we did see President Barack Obama coming in and putting a substantial amount of money when it comes to the Power Africa initiative that is meant to boost energy capacity in the continent, which is one of the striking comments in the AGOA, where Kenya really needs to address energy costs so as to be able to export more to the global stage. Do you really feel Trump can just ignore Africa and say, hey, I can work with the other countries, the Kremlins, that being Russia, and also, as you've rightly said it, Mexico. Does he really have to work with Africa?
You remember when he was campaigning, the remarks he made about Africa are such. And then when you come to AGOA, it's a presidential pardon, assistance to those countries who can export goods to the U.S. duty-free, quota-free, except arms. Now, in terms of AGOA, much of initiative has not been taken, but it's a presidential pardon, which a president can give it or waive it or remove it. That's one. That's as far as AGOA is concerned. Two, the Americans, the way they voted, they are more concerned with their issues and the immigrants. And that issue of immigrants, you saw it even brought the election in Brexit, is the issue of immigrants. Even in Kenya, we're just lucky that immigrants are not staying next to us. Had that Dabab camp be in a place like Gilgil here or Naivasha, you might not like the immigrants. So those are issues that country. But as far as the U.S. is concerned, to Africa, we're not much. You're talking about the economy of 324 million people, and say Kenya, 40 million people, poor people, they're not concerned. And when Donald Trump was campaigning, you remember he used to make off remarks that he'll make sure he sends Obama home. He wasn't questioning whether Obama is in America or not. So to him, he has to reverse all that Obama brought in, including the Obamacare. And I don't see him getting concerned about Africa and Kenya per se. Although from diplomatic perspective, they will do trade, they'll talk, but I see their focus on a Trans-Pacific area against China and also seeing Germany. Those are the major trading partners that which I think will concern them.
And Okach, just before Joy jumps in, of course, we've seen Africa being labeled as the next growth frontier, substantial foreign direct investments coming through, be it from the United States, be it from France. And now that Trump's foreign policy is really pro-aid, how is this going to play out in the coming days, knowing pretty well that Kenya is one of the bright spots now that you're seeing regional economic growth being pegged at about 6%?
Initially, they wanted Kenya because Kenya was helping them to fight Al-Shabaab. Beyond that, they're not much concerned about Kenya. But also, the era of aid is now getting down. When we had President Kibaki, when Kibaki was the president of Kenya, we had a time where we were meeting our budget, 80% of our collection, we were using that for our budget purposes. So depending on foreign aid is not helpful. So it's important for us to look at our issues. The way Trump was talking, saying that these Africans must take care of the issues themselves, I think it's our time also to take care of our issues. I don't think of getting aid. But we are a growing economy. We are expanding because of the population. We need to use the population. We need to come with the reforms and make sure we use the youth to get jobs, create more opportunities, the way China used the population to come up. That's what we should think of, but not aid.
Felix, for the longest time possible, we have been on the African continent dependent on aid. And if the United States, one of the biggest aid donors to the African continent, now decides that they're going to cut down on how much aid comes to the continent, what is our plan B, considering we don't exactly have a plan on how not to do without aid? Because what we're seeing now is that with Brexit, we're going to see aid coming to Africa also coming down. And now with the Donald Trump presidency, you know, we're still going to see aid. We're in a position where we're not so sure how much aid is going to come to the African continent. And while with the United Kingdom, you know, there is triggering Article 50 before the United Kingdom can finally pull out of the EU, when it comes to the United States, you know, this is something that's going to happen. Starting January, Donald Trump will be sworn in, and then we'll start to see all these changes happening. Can we do without this aid? And what is the plan? Can we actually formulate strategies that can help us do without this aid?
In Africa, the countries are diverse. There's some countries which, without aid, they cannot do anything. They cannot even meet the budget needs. But a country like Kenya, and I have to be practical about that, a country like Kenya, the 3 trillion budget, the bulk of it is revenue generated from within. Borrowing, the government is borrowing from within, that's through the central bank. Then the donor support comes in. The donor support which Kenya is getting, more or less like constitutional budget, is not even more than 20%. Bulk of our money is ours. Even when you see our governors going abroad, talking of wastage, all that is the tax you have collected. All we need is to restructure our usage, stop wastage, and we shall go far. But the era of donor aid is gone, because a donor aid would mean that this fellow is financing your budget. But get to the treasury statistics here in Nairobi. In Kenya, out of the 3 trillion budget, only 10 or 20% is donor aid. And that comes in terms of project. Like you see the one of standard gauge railway, it's a donor aid, but you're still paying. You see construction of some roads through European arrangement is donor aid, but we're still paying. And those ones, because they also need us and we need them. But the era of depending on donor aid, it's gone.
Strong sentiments there by Felix Kach, who is an economic analyst, just trying to dissect what a Trump presidency would mean. And Joy, I know there's a lot around the foreign policy agenda. What do you have lined up for us?
Well, not exactly the foreign policy agenda, but what a Donald Trump presidency would look like, considering the promises he made during his campaigns. And maybe we would just like to revisit some of those promises that he made. And we'll start with healthcare. And when it comes to healthcare, this is what Donald Trump said. He said he was going to repeal the Obamacare Act. As we all know, the Obamacare Act was seeking health for all and affordable health for all. But then again, he says it needs to be repealed. But we also need to consider the fact that even the Democrats themselves, some were against Obamacare for whatever reasons. They said it wasn't really affordable to all Americans. And so he thinks he's going to repeal it. And he criticized it for having several loopholes. And one of the loopholes he talked about was the insurance lobby that has been constantly trying to get Republicans to get it repealed. So there you go. And that was one of the challenges that President Barack Obama as well faced. But then when it comes to job creation as well, he says he's going to create 25 million jobs over the next decade in the United States. Is this feasible? That's a question. What kind of jobs is he going to create? You know, one challenge, just like Felix put it, is that a lot of Americans have been underpaying jobs. They think they're not paying enough. So these 25 million jobs he's going to create, who is going to take them up? Because most of the low-earning Americans, or at least most of the low-earning people in America, have been immigrants because they can take any amount of money. Americans do not think the same. Where are these 25 million jobs going to come from? That's quite a big question, but hopefully he has a plan for this. And he says jobs in the manufacturing sector have been lost to third world countries like China, where all the manufacturing goes to. So he thinks we need to create more manufacturing industries, I suppose, in the United States. But is that feasible as well?
Actually, a good point there, Joy, because when I was in Washington, one of the big conversations that was being raised at the IMF is the fact that once we have more jobs being created, the U.S. economy, in terms of the wage levels, they're pretty high. So for a manufacturer to set up, I mean, the cost of doing business is pretty high because you have to pay as per the prevailing market rates. And of course, the average American cannot just survive on $2 a day. So we're looking at the Federal Reserve Bank also trying to play an interesting balance around inflation and also the interest rates.
Great. And also still looking at job creation, you know, investing in infrastructure, reducing corporate tax rates from 35% down to 15%. And he's also talked about reducing trade deficits and easing trade regulations to boost job creation in the economy. But I don't know how he's going to do this, because when you talk about reducing trade deficits and also easing the trade regulations, we all know that at least in the United States, people are having better working conditions. And while some Americans are saying they want the minimum wage increased, they're far much better than the rest of the world. And then when it comes to immigration as well, he says that he's going to build a 2,000-mile-long wall over the U.S.-Mexico border to stop illegal immigration into the United States.
Was he serious about this?
And he actually said he was going to use Mexico to build this wall, so they have to pay for it and not the United States. But then again, banning immigration of individuals from troubled countries to end the refugee influx, yes, he has a point to an extent, because maybe there's failure in managing the refugees who are going into the United States. But then again, how does he expect the economy of the United States to progress? Because much of the drivers of the U.S. economy are driven by immigrants who are actually working in that part of the world. And still on immigration, he says he actually is in for supporting deportation of 11 million immigrants living without documentation, and also to restrict the legal immigration into the United States. So there you go. There are people who have been looking for green cards to get into the United States on a legal basis. But then there are those who have got into the United States illegally and have extended their stay there. And those are the people he wants deported back to their countries of origin. When it comes to...
This will be really devastating really to the economy.
Yes, because we're looking at 11 million people illegally living in the United States. Foreign policy, he has said he's going to charge the NATO partners for the security that the United States is providing them. And we can actually see this creating a lot of tension. We did see the reactions coming in from countries that are part of the NATO partners. But he also says he's going to send thousands of foot soldiers into the Middle East to battle Islamic State. Throughout his campaigns, if you have followed what he's been saying, some critics have been wondering whether or not he understands the difference between ISIS and ISIL, because when he talks about battling Islamic State, he sort of seems to refer to the other, a terror group, as opposed to the Islamic State. So there's a bit of confusion there, and maybe he will need a good number of people around him to advise him on how to tackle issues to do with terrorism and things like that.
And actually the foreign policy agenda by Donald Trump's campaign team was seen as to be pretty weak compared to Hillary Clinton. Of course, Donald Trump trying to bring his business mind and really focus on the economy. But of course, as you know, America actually have a lot of allies as well as some enemies that they need to actually fix moving forward.
Right, and still keeping it on the foreign policy, he's talked about revamping the U.S. foreign policy to bring the United States' interests as issues of prime importance. I don't know if he thinks Barack Obama has not been doing that, and I don't know how he plans on making sure that they are more important than what his predecessors have treated them as. He's also talked about increased alliances in Europe and tackling the ISIS threat. Again, he talks about sending foot soldiers to tackle the Islamic State. Then here he talks about increasing security as well right there. Now on international trade, like we've mentioned before, he's talked about reviewing the North American Free Trade Agreement, which he thinks is actually not making much sense. In fact, just to go on to that, he says it's one of the worst trade deals in the United States history. And he argues it out and says he's accusing China of intellectual threat of hundreds of billions of dollars annually, and Mexico and China both currency manipulation and unfair trade practices. So he thinks that the North American Free Trade Agreement needs to be reviewed. He also thinks that there is need for a review of the Trade Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the Principal Secretary for Trade as well did talk about how Donald Trump is big on that. So there is less concentration on the African continent, and whether or not he thinks there's a need for review, then that is also something we can wait and see in the coming days. So this is just a quick snip of what we should expect from the Donald Trump presidency. But again, there are people who are seeing opportunity in all of these challenges. While the Democrats think this is going to be tough times, there are a number of countries like Russia and China and India who think there's a lot of opportunity here. Now, talking about climate change, Donald Trump thinks the Climate Change Act is just a waste of time. It's a sham, and he is actually opposing the regulations of the energy industry. So he thinks that regulating the energy industry is going to sort of squeeze them in a box. They're not going to be able to reach out to their full potential. So he thinks that climate change is just a sham. You know, we shouldn't pay much attention to it. And he has mentioned that he would scrap the Paris Agreement. We're talking about COP22, by the way, which is ongoing. It is ongoing in Marrakesh, Morocco, and other climate change pacts. He thinks that they're just a waste of time, and the world has better problems to deal with than just looking at all these climate change acts. So actually, there you go.
This will be one of the delicate balancing acts that the Trump presidency will have to reconsider moving forward. Because when you listen to his acceptance speech earlier today, he sounds a bit not the Trump we knew as he was campaigning. It was more of a Trump that is saying, hey, I've gotten into the Oval Office, and as much as I did mention my stand on a number of issues, perhaps we're likely to see the US elections I also show you that once you get into that office, it's more of a straight jacket, where as much as you have a lot of sentiments on different standpoints, the office is sort of, your work is cut out really, Joy. So it will be interesting to see how he maneuvers, especially around the climate change, bearing in mind America is one of the biggest emitters. Of course, in the top 10, really, China and the likes of France, also
and India.
And India, of course, which are known to be the world's factory, really.
All right. When it comes to abortion rights, this has been a very controversial issue in the United States, not just in the United States, but around the world. And he is opposed to abortion and he thinks that it should be illegal to carry out abortions in the United States unless it is in the instance where there's a case of rape, a case of incest, or someone has been forced into doing it. So he thinks that punishment should be enforced for violating mothers unless it is a matter of rape, incest, or life-threatening situation. So, and this, of course, is something that the Republicans have been so insistent on. One would actually sum it up as being the conservative side of Donald Trump, not the extreme side of him. And then, of course, there's the issue of law, where he says he supports the contentious stopping and frisking of police officers. You know how they operate in the United States.
Yes.
They frisk you up, and then, first they stop you, and then they frisk you, and they say, put your hands behind your back. And, that kind of law, or community policing, as is referred to by Donald Trump, is what he thinks is going to be the way to go. And while Hillary Clinton did not agree with it, he thinks that this is the best way to ensure law and order. Now, of course, there is the gun law as well, where he has talked about the need to have enough armed people that could intervene in any situation of the nature of mass shootings or public violence. So he thinks that in case there's a situation of mass shootings and people are armed, they're able to contain a situation. But this is actually a very extreme thought, and I hope that he's not going to let Americans actually have this kind of freedom. Because if this happens, I think America is up for some tough times.
Actually, Joy, just to chip in, of course, the gun laws debate has been a thorn in the flesh for President Obama. He did try to make amendments to this, and which was fought, and he didn't actually sail through. If you look at the American economy, really, the issue around the gun trade is quite rampant, to the extent that, as you've been seeing in the news on different media, a lot of black Americans have actually borne the brunt when it comes to the shootings and also the arrests. So I think Donald might have a point, but really life comes first. But Joy, just before I forget, I didn't quite see Donald Trump talking about issues to do with the gay rights.
Well, he hasn't really talked much about that, and it's either because he's not for it, because if you look at the Republican supporters and the Republican population in the United States, they have been very much against the LGBT rights, as opposed to how the Democrats have been treating that. They've given the LGBT a lot of freedom to, I don't want to call it practice the agenda, but to be who they really are. And this is something that the Republicans have been so conservative on. Time is yet to tell how he's going to react towards the rights and the funding going towards the education on LGBT rights as well in the United States. So we're going to be hearing more on that. But now would like to take a short break, and when we return, we will be talking more about what the Donald Trump presidency means for the rest of the world, but importantly, the United States, and how it applies to Africa, considering we are the beneficiaries of, I think, the biggest donor aid coming from the United States. Let's take